Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with how to build a really basic classical music library. We've been talking about concertos in the past two videos, and this will be the third. Then we'll go on to something else. But right now, we're still working on concertos, and today we're going to talk about one of the most interesting and the one that sort of tells us the most about concerto forms, and that's Mozart's Concerto number 20 in D minor. It's really quite an amazing piece. But Mozart concertos are going to be a little bit different from the other piano concertos we've heard, because concertos in the classical period were not the slam-bang virtuoso vehicles they became later. They were virtuoso vehicles, but in a slightly different sense. Also, we have to consider the dreaded F word. Yes, the F word, form. Actually, form is wonderful. I'm a form whore. I've said so many times. It's really, really interesting. And Mozart concertos are some of the most interesting of all concertos. But let's take a moment for a bit of a historical summary of where we are when we get to Mozart's piano concertos, because it really is important, and it'll tell you a lot about how best to listen to these works. The concerto, if you're not familiar with it, is a piece of music for a solo instrument, or sometimes many solo instruments, but usually one solo instrument, a violin, a piano, a bassoon, a trombone, I don't know, something. But usually a violin or piano, those are the popular ones, and a full orchestra. So you've got the featured player, and then you've got the band, the individual and the crowd, however you want to do it. There's this sort of fundamental opposition of forces in a concerto. The word itself comes from the Italian, which means to strive together. So you get the idea. There's two separate entities embarked on a single purpose. That's what a concerto is. But the form of the concerto in the Baroque period, before we get to Mozart, the 100 or so years previously, was exactly the same as that of the operatic aria. And this tells us something really, really, really important that you should always keep in mind in listening to classical music or any kind of music. And that's this. All musical instruments imitate the human voice. That's what they're built to do, because the most communicative instrument is you, me, us, the human voice. The human voice, preferably with words. Nothing communicates as directly and as simply and as fundamentally. If you go out and sing to somebody, I want to die, well, that's all you need to do. And what do you get? Well, someone who's listening says, oh, I want to die. I understand. You understand. And the music is designed to support that sentiment. So it will probably be dark and in a minor or unhappy key. And But that's the idea, right? But if you're going to do that with a musical instrument, like a piano or even a violin, it's going to take you a lot longer to get the point across, because there are no words if nobody is actually singing. And, you have to create, you're not going to be able to get the specificity. You're not going to be able to get the I want to die, but you can get dark, despair, sad, miserable, tragic. You can get these sentiments by writing melodies and harmonies that express those feelings when we hear them, and that do it for long enough so that we get the point. So the concerto arose out of a sort of instrumental version of what singers were doing in operas. And the classic form of the aria, which still exists today, basically, is that the orchestra plays a tune. That tune sets the mood for the aria. The singer comes in with the words. Usually there's only a few sentences of text, and they're going to sing them a million times in every possible order. I don't know, have you ever heard Handel's Messiah? There's an aria called He Was Despised. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. It's about Jesus. It's he was despised, despised he was, he despised was he despised, despised was, he despised, despised. They'll take the same three words and they'll repeat them endlessly. But the bottom line is that you have a theme. The singer comes in with some words, And then some more of the theme. The singer's theme may be the same, it may be different. That doesn't matter as long as it fits what they're doing. Then you get some more of the opening theme, and then more of the singer, then more of the theme, then more of the singer, and then they stop. That's the form of an aria, and that is also the form of the Baroque concerto. It's called ritornello form, if you want to know the technical term, because it's all based on the opening theme that returns in between appearances of the solo. So a concerto is basically that, almost exactly the same length, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, but basically that. That's what we had. Now, Mozart was the most singingest composer who ever lived. I mean, his entire program was to write gorgeous vocal melody. Wonderful, beautiful vocal melody. I mean, Mozart was one of the great composers of opera and one of the most delightful composers to sing. And all of his concertos make the solo instrument sing. That's one of the reasons why you will not hear that kind of, pounding, huge, massive sound, piano sound that we were used to from, say, the Grieg Piano Concerto or some of the others. Because for Mozart, he was still working from the premise that the piano, even though you could play with lots of notes and all 10 fingers and big block chords, was really a singer. And so a singer has a melody, and the melody is one pure line of music, and that's what you often hear in Mozart's concertos. And so you have to adjust your sense of hearing so you're not disappointed to not hear bang, boom, stuff like that. There are virtuoso moments. Of course there are. But by and large, his music is vocal music, and the piano is the singer. Think about it that way. It really will give you the right perspective. The other reason you don't hear huge piles of sound in the piano versus the orchestra is that Mozart's pianos weren't capable of doing it. The piano had not evolved to the point where it was a ginormous concert grand with fabulously huge dynamic range and welts of sonority for large concert halls. They were kind of small and brittle and dry sounding, and so making them sing was a major accomplishment. So that's the first thing you need to keep in mind when you listen to any concertos from the classical period, really up through Beethoven's. After that, the virtuoso element takes over, and the instrument gets bigger, and concert halls get bigger, and orchestras get bigger, and the contrasts get bigger, and things get closer to what we've come to expect. But that's the first point. The second point, and this is the F point, the form point. Mozart's concertos are big. They're big works. And when you think about it, if you play this concerto, it's got to be at least half an hour, maybe a little more long, but it only has 3 movements. It's not a symphony. It has 3 movements in the order fast, slow, fast. That is the standard concerto setup. But that first movement is long. The reason the piece lasts longer than most symphonies of the period is because that first movement is really, really big. And the reason it's really, really big is because Mozart is working in what we call sonata form. Oh, yes, sonata form, which you got to know about because you're going to hear it, and it's really very basic. It's based on the concept of departure and return. You start at home, you go and have some adventures in various other places, and then you return home, recognizable but somewhat changed from your experience. Very, very straightforward. In music, this is done it's articulated in a form that has an opening section, which is called an exposition, where we're introduced to our characters. And then a development where those characters have their adventures, where things happen, and the composers show us all the different feelings that these characters can have, and which we have because we're hearing them. And then finally a recapitulation, which is they come home, and everything is satisfactorily wrapped up, usually. So that's sonata form. It's a narrative form. It's a dramatic form. And in order to do this with a soloist, Mozart had to resort to some really special concepts. The last two concertos we heard, the Grieg and the Mendelssohn, began straight off with the soloist. They were also movements in sonata form. There are a million versions of sonata form. There are a million ways to do this. You can start with the soloist as the prime mover. But in Mozart's way of thinking, and also based on the earlier Baroque sense of what a concerto was, you have two players. You have the orchestra, because it's presenting the theme, or ritornello, if you want to call it that, because it returns. And then you have the soloist. And so you may have noticed, if you've heard some of these classical concertos, not just Mozart's, but some later composers used the form too. Beethoven did, Brahms did, Dvorak did in his cello concerto, that there's a big, long orchestral introduction where nothing happens with the soloist. You're just listening to the orchestra play. The orchestra is establishing its own identity and presenting some basic themes. And then, when that's over, the soloist will come in. Now, the soloist may take up the orchestra's themes. In fact, it certainly will. But it may also have some of its own. And between the two of them, they will work out how the form of the movement is going to evolve, what the main themes are, what the subsidiary themes are. But the result of that is that you get two expositions, not one, two, count them, two. You get to hear all this stuff twice. First with the orchestra, then with the orchestra and the solo. Then there is the development where the orchestra and the solo get all mixed up and the themes get all churned and done with and stuff happens to them. Then we come to the restatement, the recapitulation, where everything comes back home more or less. And again, the orchestra and the solo are working together at that point. They've worked out the terms of their engagement as the movement has gone on. And then the orchestra will pause toward the end of that section for the solo to do what's called a cadenza. The cadenza is the virtuoso part. The cadenza is the part where the solo gets to do whatever it wants with the themes that it's heard so far or introduce new ones. It can do anything it wants. And Mozart usually left that up to the soloist, who was Mozart, so he could do it, to improvise. And that's always sort of a thing, because later composers and later audiences did not want to listen to these people improvise endlessly, and so composers began to write out the cadenzas and prevent free improvisation. Beethoven wrote cadenzas for this concerto, Mozart's 20th concerto in D minor, and they're the ones most people use because they're by Beethoven and they're fabulous. So then that goes on. That can go on for 2 minutes or 5 minutes or half an hour, or usually it's like 3 or 4 minutes long or so, 2 to 3 or 4 minutes, somewhere in there. And then the movement comes to an end together. The soloist, either the orchestra finishes by itself or with the soloist playing along, but that's the end of the movement. But that's a long process. And you get to hear everything twice, more than twice, because you've got different characters playing with the material, the orchestra with all of its different members, woodwinds and brass and whatever, and the soloist. And for that reason, the first movements of concertos in classical concerto form tend to be very long. They can get really long. I mean, Beethoven and Brahms's violin concertos, those first movements can be 25 minutes long. That's a big chunk of music. Mozart can be 20 minutes long. I mean, it's really extraordinary how intricate they are thematically. And I can't gild the lily there. They are complex. Far more complex than later music. We tend to think of music as an evolutionary thing. It gets bigger and more complicated and grander and all that stuff. But in terms of form, Mozart's piano concertos are some of the most sophisticated and extraordinarily sophisticated, I guess that's the word, complex pieces of music anybody ever wrote. And the interesting thing about it is that if you look at textbooks and you look at the idea of concerto form, Mozart's is the one which is held up as the model. The truth is, nobody did what Mozart did in the classical period. It was Mozart. It was his invention. It was his thing. And some composers followed later using Mozart as their model. But the truth of the matter is that most other composers stuck to the earlier form or did some other hybrid sort of thing. There was no rule about the way it had to go. This is just the way Mozart worked it out. And that's important to recognize, too, because you may hear concertos by other composers of the classical period who are less famous than Mozart, and they're not going to do what Mozart's concertos do. Nobody did what Mozart's concertos do. So they're very, very special works. And he wrote 27 of them. The major ones begin around like number 9, from like number 9 on. They're really, really important works. And he evolved this particular way of writing a concerto where both the soloist and the orchestra are personalities that interact and define the way that they're going to interact as the music proceeds. Now, after you get to the first movement, you get a slow movement, which is usually, after that, everything's very easy. The movements basically go the way they do later. You have a slow movement, which is a song, an aria of sorts, some sort of very beautiful or lyrical thing in which the piano is the singer. The orchestra accompanies gently. It's very beautiful, it's soulful, and it goes on for a few minutes. Then you have the zippy finale, which features the orchestra, the solo, just alternating freely, doing whatever they want to do. I mean, you don't have to worry about the form after the first movement, but that's why you get these big, long first movements with these big, long orchestral introductions. And now that you know that, there's absolutely nothing more you need to know, except go listen to Mozart's 20th Concerto in D minor. Oh, wait, there is one other thing I want to mention, actually. This concerto is in D minor. You may have noticed that the first 6 works in this series now, if you've been taking them in order, or if you take them in order, all began in minor keys and all wound up in happier major keys. In other words, they all followed an emotional trajectory from darkness to light, sadness to happiness, turbulence to calm, to however you want to put it. Each composer did it differently. Each composer does it in its own way. And the opening alone, the minor key proposition, the unhappy, sad, dark, tragic, whatever you call it, expressive opening, has it's going to encounter huge amounts of contrast along the way, both within the movement in which it starts and between the different movements or sections of the work. There's just a huge variety and range of emotion on the way to that triumphant finale. You see, it's like a Shakespeare tragedy, right? I mean, they're not dismal from the beginning, not at all. They may be dark. I mean, Hamlet's dark. He's upset. He's miserable. But there's a love interest. It has comedy. It has all kinds of, emotional variety built into it in the plot, in the narrative. Well, that's what happens in these works too. And the vast majority of pieces in the classical tradition are not going to follow the miserable to happy trajectory. They just don't. Most pieces are rather happy, rather cheerful. And the contrasts are between cheer and sadness, and then ending cheerfully. The emotions can come in any proportion, in any range, in any intensity, and they're all different. But I wanted to start this way with this very simple trope, this very simple concept of darkness to light or tragedy to triumph in these first 6 works, because it helps for you to understand both the general proposition. This is the overall big form trajectory, the large scale vision of what's going on, but then to hear how each composer works it out brilliantly in their own personal way. No 2 composers do it exactly the same. No 2 works are exactly the same. They all have their individual way of expressing this similar, very, very basic concept. And this particular concerto, Mozart's 20th, is no exception. The first movement is just extremely turbulent, especially for the classical period. The opening is wonderfully dark and disturbed and upsetting. The second movement is a romance. It's just beautiful. It's serene. It's beyond lovely. The tunes are gorgeous. The finale begins in the same key, D minor, as the opening, so it seems to be wanting to end unhappily until you get to the very end, until you get to the coda, in which case Mozart says, screw it, and decides to end happily. And it's not something that happens evolutionarily. It's a surprise. All of a sudden, bang, you're in the happy ending. And sadness is banished. Poof, kerplooey. There was a lot of pressure in the classical period to end things happily. Mozart was quite special in that he didn't always do that. But here he does, and he does it in an almost giddy kind of way, almost similar to what Tchaikovsky did. Remember Tchaikovsky at the end of his Fourth Symphony said, if you can't be happy, go to the people, go to the crowd, just have a party. Just ignore the misery and move on with your life. Well, that's kind of what Mozart does, although he does it differently. Of course, Tchaikovsky has a fate theme, and, you'll listen to them and compare them and see how the two composers operate, each in their own individual way. And that's the lesson, if there's a lesson here, that I think we should take from this. So after this, what are we going to do? Oh, I think we may do some symphonic poems and things, some other works that are not big, huge multi-movement things, but are just fun to listen to and are part of the really, really basic classical music library. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.